Kia ora and welcome in to number 5 of our Good News series, and this is the final climactic session in this series for us. If you're just jumping in here, you might enjoy going back to the start and watching all of these because they kind of build on one another as we go along. But where we're up to today is talking about the idea of the spirit of life and a new way of being. And it builds on what we've been discussing in particular over the last couple of weeks, and this idea of salvation as both revelation and participation. And last week in particular, we focused in on this idea of revelation, which is to say, how does the Jesus story reshape our view of God and the world and ourselves? And how is that good news? And so we looked at the idea that in the Jesus story itself, we see a God who is not distant and detached, but one who in solidarity has entered into the fullness of human experience in the Christ and also of creation itself, and so God who is truly with us, who is deeply empathetic and compassionate, self-giving love, who has joined in with our experiences of challenge and pain and joy and sorrow and love and grief, and a God whose saving power doesn't look like sort of a superhero coming from the sky with climactic music and who takes control of everything, but instead kind of a self-giving love that changes things from these sort of the ground up, So we talked a bit about that last week and why that might be good news for us. And today we want to talk more about this idea of salvation as participation, and in particular how the Spirit folds into this story. And it's because these two ideas seem to go hand in hand, in particular kind of in the wake of the Jesus story in the New Testament, which is where the followers of Jesus seem to be shaped, yes, by what's happened with Jesus, but also the sense that the divine is present to them by the Spirit in a particular kind of way that shapes their ongoing spirituality and faith. So it's not like we believe in this guy who used to be around, but instead we are kind of we are walking with, experiencing and aware of God present to us in a particular kind of way. And so we want to think a little bit about that, and that's important for lots of reasons. But in one sense, it's important because rather than just having either like a historical figure to sort of reflect on and follow their teachings, or just a sort of a worldview or a way of seeing to adopt, there's actually a kind of a more mystical, dynamic, even fluid kind of reality to engage with here, which is what happens when we sort of we tune in to what the Spirit might be doing among us. And that's important also because what can happen with any kind of religious system, no matter how good it starts off, and if you look at the Jesus system, it's the Jesus story and Jesus' life and teachings and actions, he's constantly kind of disrupting, he's constantly flipping things upside down, he's constantly breaking things open and broadening out and opening us up. But what's easy to happen over time, even as we follow someone like Jesus, is to slowly turn that into a narrow system of instructions and rules and beliefs that end up becoming controlling and kind of oppressive, and the very kind of thing that Jesus came to disrupt and break apart. And so in the New Testament in particular, it's the Spirit that becomes, if you like, the one moving among the people who helps them resist that temptation to close everything down in again and turn it into kind of just a code or a rule, a set of rules or whatever. So that's kind of important for us to pay attention to so that we don't do the same thing. And it certainly for significant chunks of the church's history and story, it has given into that temptation to turn kind of the spirituality that we find in the Christ story into a system and into a controlling kind of set of obligations and rules and laws. And so on. So we want to pay some attention to this as a part of the good news and a really important part of the good news. So I want to do that through 3 words: inspiration, liberation, and improvisation. So let's start with inspiration and the way in which the followers of Jesus in the wake of the Jesus sort of life, death, and resurrection seem to they gather together and they have this kind of mystical experience, right? Something we call Pentecost. They have this collective experience that seems to shape much of their kind of ongoing life. Now, what's not happening here is it's not like the Holy Spirit was never around until Jesus came along, and because Jesus saved us, now the Holy Spirit can come. That's not really what's happening here. Because if you look at the story right from the beginning, even the sort of the creation mythologies of Genesis, the Spirit is present right from the very beginning, and the Spirit is woven all the way throughout the story of God's people and of what God's up to in the world. And so there's a continuity here. But what does seem to have happened is that because of the way in which Jesus has kind of opened things up and transformed their view of God and what God is like and what God is up to and what God might be doing, even with them, a bunch of people who might not be the most likely candidates, they become open to and alive to the Spirit in a particular kind of way that then shapes the formation of the church going forward. And so the invitation here for us is to cultivate this awareness of and experience of the Spirit present to us as the one who guides and shapes and nurtures and speaks, coming alive to this divine presence that's actually already among us, coming alive to this divine presence that's already around us and among the people that we engage with and encounter. And so there's this sense of enlivening, might be a word for it, or inspiration, of living what sometimes it's talked about in the New Testament as living by the Spirit or filled with the Spirit or whatever, which is this idea of kind of instead of walking around feeling like I'm on my own here, we instead are invited to sense God present to us in a way that's kind of inspiring and actually moves within us if we can allow ourselves to pay attention to that. And that's kind of, I think, interesting because what it stops this from being is simply just either sort of a morality system or an ethical system or a worldview or a historical figure, but instead is kind of a faith that is alive within us. And at one point, the Apostle Paul says that God has poured his love out into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. So again, this love, even that we see in Jesus, is not just something that we look at Jesus and go, yes, God, if God is in the Jesus story, then God is obviously really loving and Jesus was a loving guy. But instead, as well as that, there's this sense that actually we are able to experience that love in some kind of existential, personal, experiential kind of way. And this is a little bit of what Jesus is getting at when he has a chat there's a Jewish leader called Nicodemus who comes to see him in the night and wants to figure out what Jesus is saying. And Jesus says, you must be born again of the Spirit. But the Spirit is like the wind. No one knows where it's come from or where it's going. And so and Nicodemus kind of struggles with this and he wants to figure out he's like, I'm a grown man. How do I be born again? Do I get back in my mother's womb? And Jesus kind of breathes a sigh of exasperation and introduces him to the idea of a metaphor. What the metaphor is trying to invite Nicodemus into is this idea that this is not just about some kind of set of obligations or rules. This is about actually coming alive to something, about becoming awake to something or to someone. That someone, that spirit that we're kind of coming alive to, is not entirely predictable or systematized or can be figured out because it's like the wind, it moves and blows. And so there's something kind of alive to this, there's something dynamic to this rather than a philosophy. And you may be kind of aware of that, maybe, I don't know. When we start to talk about our experience of the divine, that brings up all sorts of different ideas for people, and some people have had some very vivid experiences in their life and they say, I feel like that was God, and those are really important to us. And then for others are like, I'm not sure if I've had an experience like that. And yet our experience of the divine as this kind of inspiring, dynamic, enlivening force present to us can take shape in such wildly different ways. For some people it's in nature and on a mountain or in the sea. Some people it's in prayer or meditation, or sometimes it's just a combination of all of those different things. For some of us it's just when we're in the midst of a difficult situation or we're dealing with people who are really different to us and suddenly we see something new and something comes alive to us. There are lots of different ways in which that sense of experience can be made known to us or can be one that we can pay attention to. And so not everybody is going to have the sort of the obvious experience that some people seem to have. And the Spirit is like the wind, I guess. No one quite knows exactly what it looks like to experience the Spirit. And it looks different for different ones of us. And so the hope here is not that that this turns into something that becomes a kind of you have it or you don't, or you got it or you didn't, or you're in or you're out, but instead able to see that the Spirit is moving and speaking and enlivening within all of us all of the time. and we're just sort of trying to tune into that and pay attention to that. So that's this idea of inspiration. I want to talk quickly about the idea of liberation, and there's kind of two ways in which, at least two ways in which liberation is spoken about in the New Testament in relation to the Spirit. One is this idea, and in particular, you see this in the writings of the Apostle Paul, that the Spirit liberates us from a rigid rules-based approach to spirituality and faith. And that kind of ties into what I've been saying already. So in the letter to the Galatians church, he says, Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand, never again let anyone put a harness of slavery on you. And he's, elsewhere he says, where the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, or there is liberty. So there's this idea of kind of a liberation from a form of spirituality that closes you in and says you have to do this, 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 and this, and instead an opening you up to sort of a coming alive to, and there's a liberation that comes into that. So this is not really about sort of, faith is about following the rules, or the flip side of that the rules, I just get to do what I want. Because both of those are actually kind of a part of the same system. They both function on a, is it rules or not rules kind of, am I going to follow the rules or not follow the rules kind of spirituality. Instead, there's actually a liberation to then come alive to the Spirit and to see where it is that the divine might be taking us, right? Which is kind of more interesting in many respects. The other side of liberation that we see in the New Testament is liberation from oppression. And so one of Jesus' first sermons in the Gospel of Luke is, the Spirit of the Lord is on me and has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, and freedom for the prisoner, and recovery of sight for the blind, and to release the oppressed. And so the Spirit has seemed to be at work in liberating those who are oppressed, both kind of internally through the way in which maybe religion has functioned, or our view of self has functioned, or others' expectations of us have functioned, but also a liberation from the oppression of the systems and structures that keep people poor and impoverished and suffering. And so the Spirit is present all through that, functioning to bring liberation. The third thing I want to mention, and this is the last one, is improvisation. And this is the idea that, again, I guess these are all connected. But I was thinking about what it means to sort of walk in a way that is guided and shaped by the sense of the Spirit of the divine who might be with us and among us. And I thought it was a little bit like kind of playing jazz, maybe playing in a jazz band. Don't know if you're a jazz person. If you're not, just substitute that for a different form of music. But I think, as someone who plays music, I think about the idea of improvisation when I play music. And, it might be that you start with a scale or a set of chords, or, you've kind of got a base to work from. But then as you play that and as you come to know that, you can start to kind of improvise in the spirit of the song, right? In the spirit of where things are going. And that doesn't mean you just keep repeating the same chords over and over. It doesn't mean you keep repeating the same notes and same riffs over and over. They become your kind of grounding, but you move from there and you start to improvise and to play and to kind of just feel and sense where the thing is going. And I feel like sort of life in the Spirit, if to use that phrase, is kind of like that. And you do that not just as an individual. So you do that as an individual, but if you're playing kind of in a band, then you're also listening to what the others in the band are doing and how that kind of flows in with what you're doing. And as they play, then you get an idea and then you kind of bounce off that. And so there's this beautiful kind of improvisation that happens here that allows for a dynamic, fluid, moving kind of faith and spirituality rather than a very rigid kind of stuck one. We see this in something like Acts chapter 15, where the church has to decide, initially they thought Christianity was just a Jewish thing, and it seems to be opened up. It's the Spirit has kind of done it almost outside of their control, where now these Gentiles, these non-Jewish people, are coming to faith in Jesus. And what do we do with this? Is this okay or is this not okay? And they gather together and they have a big meeting about this, and then they make a decision. And when they sort of communicate their decision, they use this phrase to say, yeah, okay, we've decided it's all good. And the phrase they use is, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. So there's this kind of improvisation that's being done here that seems it's kind of in tune with the song. Is this in tune with the Jesus story? What do we feel like the Spirit is leading us into here? And how do we do this together and not just on our own? And so that kind of collective sense of discernment, I guess, is like a spiritual word for it. That's actually guiding the early followers of Jesus, where we should go, what we should do, how we should live, what is harmful and what is healthy. There's a dynamic approach to that allows actually for change over time, but that still plays kind of in tune with the song. And so I find that a helpful metaphor to think about when I think about what it looks like to live kind of by the Spirit. And so there we go. Inspiration, liberation, and improvisation as 3 words to help you think about what it is to live in the spirit of life and with this new way of being. This is about participation. It's not just about a set of ideas. It's about something that actually kind of comes alive within us and around us, and we start to see it in others too. And we can enter into the movement of that with kind of joy and passion, you know. So the invitation is to learn, to lean in, to listen, to pay attention to the Spirit that doesn't come from out there somewhere, but actually is within all things, is the heartbeat and the source of life in all of creation. And we learn to kind of lean in and to listen and to pay attention, not just in our own, but also with others, and especially perhaps sometimes with others who are a bit different to us, because then we get to see and hear something different. And perhaps for some of us, we want to lean in to those moments where something mystical can open up, maybe something of the experience of the divine. Wesley uses this phrase, his heart was strangely warmed. And that's kind of a nice idea. I don't know where you're at or how you feel about the idea of God or the Spirit or that kind of language. And I know it brings up lots of different things for lots of different people. But I do know that for many of us, the reason we kind of have a faith is because as we do kind of lean in and pay attention and listen, there's a sense that we're connected to something or to someone. There is this God present to us. And I don't know why some people sense that and some don't. And there's no answers to those kinds of questions. But I think the hope is that as we pay attention to the good news of the Jesus story, we are able to open ourselves up in such a way that we can start to kind of see and hear the song that is kind of playing all the time, and maybe even join in with it. And so that's where our Good News series leaves us. I hope you found this to be helpful if you've been following along. I think that's all I have to say. So, ka kite.